She is the very definition of a predator.
A trial date is now set for this former Tennessee teacher accused of sexually assaulting at least 21 of her students. If that's not enough, she's allegedly pregnant, and the baby's father is one of her victims.
The paternity of that baby could be proof of the sexual contact.
In all, she's been indicted on 23 charges.
So just seeing those charges on that indictment lends credibility to the victims' stories here.
And the allegations are shocking.
All of these victims, 23 counts, not just of the sexual nature, but also of intimidating a witness, coercing a witness, things like that. That is really bad, really bad.
With all these charges and the evidence that goes along with them, is there even a possible defense?
They are children, and there is no such thing as consensual sex with a child. It is rape. It does not matter your position of power.
To understand the case better and to predict where it's headed, we sat down with criminal defense attorney Serena Townsend.
And it just exemplifies how terrifying this woman, the fact that this woman had access to all of those children is. It's really scary.
The teacher in question is Alissa McCommon, who once taught elementary school at Charter Academy in Covington, Tennessee. Law&Crime began following her case last September when McCommon was first arrested. Police began investigating McCommon in August 2023 after receiving a tip about an inappropriate relationship she was having with a former student. Initially, McCommon was charged with rape and booked into the Tipton County Jail on September 8th. Shortly after, she was released on $25,000 bond. But that was just the beginning. McCommon was arrested again days later after allegedly violating a no-contact order and reaching out to the victim. At that court appearance, prosecutors played snippets of a voicemail McCommon made, allegedly confessing she was pregnant with the boy's baby.
I will never text you again. You will never hear from me again. Just please don't say anything. I'm under so much stress and I'm so scared all the time. I'm trying to tell you when it comes out. I'm looking like you. We don't have to talk anymore. Just please, God, tell me you're not going to say anything. I'll never speak to you again.
McCommon was arrested again, and this time bond was revoked. So she was arrested back in September of last year, released on bond, and then arrested again for violating the conditions of that bond by reaching out to one of the survivors. What do you make of that?
We like to call that consciousness of guilt, right? So if you're reaching out to somebody to either try to coerce them to not move forward, I think one of the text messages said, you're going to regret this if you go forward. That's a threat. So now you're threatening the very victims, who are saying that you did these horrible things to them. It is a very bad thing to do that. I mean, it's literally a crime to violate an order of protection in that way, and the conditions of your release. And so it's going to look very bad for her. That evidence might even be able to come in during the trial at hand, and it's going to make her look terrible. And the right thing was done after the fact, which is her bond was revoked, and now she's no longer able to communicate because she doesn't deserve to. She obviously didn't listen to the court's instructions.
In March, McCommon was indicted on 23 charges. Here's how they break down: rape of a child, 5 counts of aggravated statutory rape, 4 counts of sexual exploitation by electronic means, 4 counts of solicitation of a minor to commit aggravated statutory rape, 2 counts of statutory rape by an authority figure, 2 counts of coercion of a witness, 2 counts of aggravated stalking, violating the Child Protective Act, tampering with evidence, and harassment. At first, way back when, almost a year ago, we learned about one victim, but then, as you said, multiple have come forward, and now she's been indicted on 23 counts. That's a pretty large number. What do you make of that indictment?
Oh, that is a huge number. Typically in a sex crimes prosecution, you do see an indictment with some charges, usually pertaining to one, maybe 2 victims. The fact that there's 23 counts in this indictment is very telling. First of all, the more victims that come forward and have a similar story, the more credibility that story is going to have, and the higher probability of guilt will, occur in a case like that. So just seeing those charges on that indictment lends credibility to the victims' stories here. And it just exemplifies how terrifying this woman, the fact that this woman had access to all of those children is. It's really scary. It's not a situation where she could even claim that she messed up, which is really not an excuse anyway. But sometimes there's mitigation when there's one victim and there's, extenuating circumstances, I guess. I don't know how there could be extenuating circumstances in a child rape case, honestly, but where there's one victim, perhaps there's reasonable doubt for one reason or another. But all of these victims, 23 counts, not just of the sexual nature, but also of intimidating a witness, coercing a witness, things like that. That is really bad, really bad. I had originally seen, I guess, a headline, and I thought that perhaps there was one victim, and it sounds like she had multiple victims here in a pattern of sexual assaults and rape. So, really horrifying.
Let's pause this story for a second to thank our sponsor, TruthFinder.com, one of the largest public record search services in the world. Here's how it works. Go to their website, truthfinder.com, and say, for instance, you're looking at me. You type in my name, and within minutes, you get access to reports that include things like numbers, addresses, but also any criminal convictions. Now, this goes without saying, but my TruthFinder record is sparkling clean. Right now, you can get 50% off confidential background reports at truthfinder.com/LCnews for info on almost anyone. Leading up to McCommon's indictment, officials spent 7 months investigating the accusations against her, learning the shocking details of her alleged crimes. If we're going way back to when these crimes happened, at least a year ago, if not more, we know that she was a teacher and focusing in on students ages 10 to 12. There were at least a dozen, if not more. So to me, it almost sounds like grooming based on the aspects of the case that I know. Does it sound like grooming to you?
Absolutely. And I actually found it very telling that part of the statement that was put out by somebody, police or law enforcement, saying that her activities were not taking place on campus, that all of these, sexual activities and texting and things of that nature happened outside of school. To me, that's an unacceptable way to frame this because there's no way in my mind that you could separate the fact that she was their teacher and the fact that she was clearly grooming them while being their teacher and the eventual acts that she took against them. So, to me, this happened on school, out of school, and this was a pattern that was going on 24/7 in my mind.
From the start, McCommon's case drew parallels to the case of Mary Kay LeRo, a sixth grade teacher out of Seattle who was charged with second-degree rape. The story captivated the nation as LeRo eventually had 2 children with her former student, Vili Falau. The pair got married after she served prison time and spent more than 2 decades together. But Townsend says there are some major differences in McCommon's case. When we're looking at history of cases like this, the first one that pops into my head is always Mary Kay LeRo from way back when in Seattle. I believe it was the 90s, and she claimed that she was in love with the victim and eventually married him. So I know that happens from time to time that defendants would claim that they're in love with the victim or survivor rather. But in this case, there's more than a dozen survivors. So that's not something that she could claim, right?
I cannot imagine that would fly. First of all, we're not in the 90s anymore. As you and I both know, the world has changed since then. Whether or not that would have flown in the 90s, I don't see that flying these days. I don't think anybody would be okay with that. Plus, it really doesn't matter if you were in love with either one or multiple children. They are children, and there is no such thing as consensual sex with a child. It is rape. It does not matter. Your position of power, the fact that you are the age that you are and who you are to these children as somebody who's supposed to be a caring educator rather than a grooming, manipulative, sexual predator. None of that is going to matter. It would be no defense. Even if it were to be believed, it's not a legal defense to these charges.
Townsend says any sort of defense will be difficult for McCommon to put up. So what sort of defense could Alissa McCommon bring forward then? There's a lot of charges against her and a lot of survivors. Can she even combat that?
Honestly, first of all, like I said, there's no such thing as consent. So she can't say what some people have a defense of in rape cases between adults, that it was consensual. She simply cannot say that. It literally would have to be that either that it didn't happen at all and that every single child was making this up, or that it happened with somebody else and it wasn't her, which is also not believable. So she's going to have to basically say something like, these kids didn't like me because maybe I was a teacher that held them to a high standard and I didn't give them good grades or something like that. I guess she would potentially say, but it sounds like even just based on the charges, there's something about it sounds like there might be video evidence of some nature because there was a sexual exploitation by electronic means listed in the indictment. That leads me to believe that there's some sort of recording, maybe, of the acts, or maybe there's text messages or pictures that were taken and posted or distributed on some level. So I just don't see a defense here, honestly, at all. I think that her defense team is going to basically have to plead to the sympathy of the judge, if there is any sympathy to be had, and say, whatever mitigation there is for a lesser sentence. I don't see this going to trial.
If the case makes it to trial, McCommon's past could come back to haunt her. When McCommon was arrested way back in September of last year, there were allegations that she was pregnant by one of her students. And at the time, we saw photos of her. She wasn't showing. I mean, it could have been up in the air. I actually spoke to her attorney at the time who said, I don't know for sure. She might not even be pregnant. Have you spoken with McCommon? Is she pregnant?
Well, I can't confirm or deny any of that at this moment. It's, I know basically what what you guys had heard from the hearing. There is, to my knowledge, there's no medical evidence right now that she is or isn't pregnant. That's yet to be seen.
Fast forward to now, there are photos and videos of her in court. She's clearly showing that she is pregnant. So does the paternity of that baby factor in at all?
Absolutely. The paternity of that baby could be proof of the sexual contact. I mean, it's the best possible proof. Very rarely do we, well, not very rarely, but it's sometimes difficult to obtain DNA in cases like this. And the best DNA is the baby, him or herself. I mean, that is a product of two people, that child. The other side of that story though is it's really heartbreaking for whoever's child that it I mean, we don't know which person impregnated her, and it's going to turn someone's life completely upside down, potentially a victim of hers, and that's really the saddest part of all.
Do you have any idea what would happen once the baby is born? Who would have custody?
Wow, that is a really good question. If she's incarcerated, there are ways for her to be, seen and taken care of medically, and the child to be taken care of medically. They would transport her, to a hospital, and in some jails and some prisons, they allow visitation, even of that infant child. But I could imagine that after that child is born, that there will be a major custody battle. The first thing will be identifying who the father is, and then the family of that person, the survivor, who may be a child himself, is going to have to intervene and make some very difficult decisions.
McCommon's case was set to be tried next month, but it's since been pushed back. Originally, it was for August and then pushed to January of next year. Why might that have been pushed off?
So it does take a lot of preparation for a prosecutor to present a case. Remember that the burden of proof is extremely high in a criminal prosecution. It's beyond a reasonable doubt. So you can't just show up to court and say, kind of willy nilly, here's some evidence and here's a child that's going to say X, Y, and Z happened. You have to have pretty much an airtight case. Now, compounding that is they want to get the convictions for all of the counts, all of the survivors. They want justice, I assume, for everybody. So imagine, 11, 12 victims potentially here. You're going to have to prove 11 cases essentially in one trial. And so there's a lot to be done, especially because in the beginning there was only one survivor and, the case was probably proceeding on that track. Now that they have more people who came out, there needs to be additional evidence collection and a lot of preparation for this trial.
If and when the case does go to trial, Townsend expects new evidence to be presented, and she says it'll likely be damning. You spoke about evidence that we could see, including text messages or videos. Obviously, we have a lot of children who came forward and told their stories. So I'm wondering, how are prosecutors ensuring that these children are not being re victimized? I know in some cases they're required to testify, or it would help yielding in a conviction for them to testify. But how do the prosecutors here make sure that they're not re victimizing them?
It's an excellent question and especially pertinent in this case because, as you know, when she was released on bail the first time, she actually contacted one of her victims, which was certainly in violation of an order of protection that was in place. And now she got her bond revoked and is awaiting trial behind bars. So you're right to be concerned about the re-victimization of these children. And certainly the prosecution takes that into account, I would hope. Yes, when you go to trial and you have to put the victims on the stand, it reopens the wounds, it reopens the trauma to have to not just even take the stand, but the preparation that it takes. They have to meet with law enforcement numerous times. And so, oftentimes, what a prosecutor does try to do is negotiate a deal with opposing counsel and say, listen, we have a treasure trove of evidence here. Your client is facing potentially up to such and such amount of years if she goes to trial and loses, which she certainly will. If I'm the prosecutor, that's the position I'm taking. What is your client willing to take here? And what are we going to be satisfied with? And what are the survivors and the families going to be satisfied with respect to a plea? And I think that's probably how this is going to end up resolving.
You theorize that this case would probably end in a plea deal. Are there any other predictions that you have as this case moves forward?
I do think that the case will end with a plea deal. I think if it does go to trial, I don't see how she's not found guilty. I don't have all of the evidence in front of me, but what we do know is simply so damning. And that DNA test potentially of that child that she's carrying right now is yet another piece of evidence that can be used against her. So I think a conviction is not only warranted but practically guaranteed in this case. The other thing that I can predict is probably she'll try, if there is a plea, to really fall on her sword during the sentencing portion, try to get the judge to give her some sort of sympathy. I don't know where she's going to find that sympathy, but I assume there's going to be a ton of negotiating behind closed doors, and then hopefully, the right thing happens. I mean, I'm hoping that she gets rehabilitated somehow after she's punished for this case, but just based on her actions, these predatory actions of hers, it is really frightening that she was able to become a teacher. And I just hope that as long as this does end with a plea, that part of that plea deal is that she has to register as a sex offender and that she could never have involvement with teaching or educating children ever again.
While Townsend believes the case will likely end with a plea deal, if it moves forward without one, McCommon could face more than one trial. I've also seen some reports that because there are multiple survivors, prosecutors could opt to change this into multiple trials rather than just one. And on each of her individual counts or interactions, rather, with the survivors could be a different trial. So, how would prosecutors weigh the pros and cons of that?
That's a really good question, and it goes all towards strategy. The truth of the matter is, most defense attorneys want to sever the cases in that kind of way and say, listen, my client, the evidence against my client is much weaker, or the evidence against my client on this particular case is much weaker than the evidence in a different case. Because, in my opinion, it's a much stronger case to go forward with all of the victims in front of the same jury. A jury is not supposed to take into account what's called propensity evidence, meaning evidence that, let's say, they're convinced that she committed crime number one, that therefore it means she also committed crimes two, three, and four. They're supposed to take a look at the evidence in each and every case for what it is. But that being said, it's very difficult to separate that as a juror. So, as a prosecutor, I would probably prefer to present all of the cases at once, as long as they're all strong, to a jury rather than to sever.
In the end, Townsend reminds us the importance of honoring the survivors in their path to healing. Are there ways that these survivors can move forward in their life?
Sure. I mean, the trauma that the survivors are going to be experiencing now and in the future is immeasurable. And it's really unfortunate, because this is something that in my mind should never, obviously in everyone's mind, should never have happened. How to move forward? Sure. I mean, there are ways to try to dull the trauma with therapy and, things of that nature. Hopefully seeking justice in this case will give some measure of closure on that front as well. Obviously, there's the opportunity not just for justice in criminal courts, but potentially in civil court. Again, there's an opportunity perhaps not only to sue her, but the school. If the school knew or should have known what was happening, there's a lot of things an investigation might uncover there. So, in those ways, there's some sort of, help mentally with the survivors, but honestly, in my practice, you see that these kinds of wounds don't ever heal fully.
McCommon's trial date is now set for January 1st, 2025, and ahead of that, she's due back in court on August 19th. Reporting for Law&Crime, I'm Sierra Gillespie.